go. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
That's good, wasn't it? Yeah, spontaneous.
Yeah.
What is it about them? Really? There we have it. Okay, darling. See you later. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye. So this is it, 40 years of work. Let's look at the mind maps today and take a tour. So welcome, I'm Brian Weller, and this is the studio. I'm showing here a retrospective of mind maps I've created really over the last 35, 40 years or so. This is just a selection here we're looking at. But maybe I could start by talking a little bit about the history of mind mapping and then some of the techniques we use and also some of the ways we can use mind maps, different purposes and uses. The term mind mapping was really created in the very early 1980s. I was one of the early founder members along with Tony Buzan and Peter Russell, Mark Brown, Brian Helvig Larsen, Ada Svensson, a few others. And we really met around Tony Buzan, who'd written a classic book called Use Your Head. And this was a book for the BBC, introducing a whole new approach to study. And originally we called mind maps, we called them brain patterns. And then that evolved until we really took the alliteration, if you will, of mind mapping. Seemed to be a good term. I prefer to call them, it's really cognitive cartography. We're not really mapping the mind here. What we're really mapping is knowledge, wisdom, and content, and relationships of information. So it's really about cognition, and cartography, of course, is map making. My sense is that human beings, we're really born creators. If you think of the curiosity that all forms of life, and especially human life, shows, that quest, that search for knowledge, for, I guess, meaning. And as we grow through life, of course, what's growing inside of us is this amazing architecture. And of course, we're referring to the central nervous system and specifically the brain. And what neuroscience has shown us over the years, the research, is that there is an operating system of the mind and the brain, and as a sort of a self-referral system. There's an operating system whereby when we're learning, what is happening is the whole brain is changing. Its architecture is changing through the networks of neurons or brain cells that occur when we're taking information in, processing it, and then learning. And of course, the entire cycle of life every day, which is a binary cycle, of course, from night to day, off and on, this rhythmic sense, this circadian rhythm, and the infradian and ultradian rhythms, really are, that you could say, is the sort of driver of how we really think, create, and learn. So what I've been doing over a number of years, in fact, I would say, like many people, I was drawing a lot as a child, making marks, pictures. Most children do that, but I never stopped. And what interested me, really my passion, was diagram. Really, it's really the grammar of thinking through ideas and relationships of ideas in terms of patterns, flow, and structure. And when I got to university, and I went through an industrial design degree, I started creating these very large diagrams of ideas and thoughts and processes that really backed up how you design anything. particularly consumer durables and designing systems of various kinds. And then as the 1970s, when I got into that whole decade, most of that time I took studying with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which is where I met Peter Russell. And it was Peter who introduced me to Tony in the 1970s. And of course, we started formalizing the whole process of what we now know as mind mapping. If you go back through very distant history, you see the surgical papyrus from Egypt. Again, diagrammatic ideas put down in non-linear forms. And then, of course, coming up to the great master of the Renaissance, Da Vinci, many of Da Vinci's drawings are annotated with keywords and different vector relationships. You could think of them as early maps. And of course, mapping and cartography have been very central to human discovery. Most mapping, of course, has been about outer space in the sense of land topography, as we discovered the planet we live on. And the big step of cognitive cartography, mind mapping, is really mapping inner space. And that's really the space of our thinking and learning. The principles we use in mapping are very precise principles. As you're noticing as we look around the room here and the studio, you'll notice that maps are really have a center, and everything radiates from that center. A little bit like looking down at a tree from the air, where you see the central trunk, and then with the branches radiating out, and then the twigs and so on. And it's this center peripheral flow of information, which very much mirrors the way that networks of neurons work in the brain. Of course, we use color and graphics. We use keywords and connections. We really use the full, you could say, the full creative power of our senses and thinking. Interestingly enough, if you take a book, and classically, textbooks have been the sort of centerpiece, if you like, of academic learning. And if you just look at a page of text, really, in a way, if you think of that as a display to the brain that would guarantee that you would forget, that's what it would look like. Because the way that we actually study and learn internally is not in a linear form. That's really what our mouth is doing, if you think about it. One word after the other. Whereas how thinking works is much more radial, it's much more to do with relationships of ideas. So think of it in a way like you have a computer and a printer, and the way that we've been teaching our children particularly has been like teaching them on the level of the printer, through text and through hearing what we say. Thinking, on the other hand, and creating and learning is a way more dynamic, multi-sensory, much more radial approach. And that's really what mind mapping is about. So the whole purpose of this show here is to give you some idea of really how this technique can be used for different kinds of purposes. Certainly putting down one's ideas, classically brainstorming, ideas that come, whether they come, with a project in mind or just ideas for poetry, or planning, let's say planning a vacation, whatever. To put ideas down in a radio form as they come is very efficient, very fast. It's also in keeping, again, with how the mind is thinking. But that's just one application. When I teach courses on this technique, I usually teach, along with mapping, different practices for being able to deconstruct entire textbooks, particularly for students in the business schools where I teach, where they have a lot to read, whether it's online or in print. And so one application of mapping is really how to deconstruct a text or a lecture, for example, and then recreate it in a pattern form that imprints it into the mind. So you could say that maps in this particular example are really the end result of a process. There's another very important part of this whole field, this emerging field of learning, and that's to do with memory. Memory has been very poorly understood until I would say particularly the last 100 and 120 years, when the great scientists from Germany, people like Hermann Ebbinghaus and others, were starting to study scientifically how memory works. And really the whole field of neuroscience has grown out of this amazing depth of study. In fact, one of the maps we'll be looking at goes into the history of how we've been understanding and mapping the brain itself, from those very early days. But the whole field of memory is a fascinating one. Memory is much more than, quote, remembering. Memory is actually an active process of being able to take in impressions from the world through the senses and then be able to organize those impressions into really maps of reality. When we sleep at night, when we dream, there's a huge amount of activity during, for example, REM or rapid eye movement sleep on the level of the synapses. The synapses being the sort of the very fine gaps between the neurons as they interconnect. And those gaps are modified with the neurotransmitters, especially during sleep. So it gives us an idea, an insight into this rest activity cycle. When we're learning, it's not just about what we experience during our waking state, or whether we're in a business meeting, or maybe in a lecture somewhere, or in a conversation. The resting state is when the brain is like, it's not, we're taking some downtime when we sleep at night, but the brain is actually busy processing and digesting all of that extraordinary experience we've had during the day. And it's really understanding that which then gives us a whole platform for redesigning how we learn. So that's one whole application of mapping. Another application of mapping is really in facilitation. Working dynamically with groups in a room, whether it's in a business setting or in a community setting. That's one of the areas I really love with this particular technique or technology, is being able to do live mapping as people are talking in the room. They can begin to see how their ideas take form, how they shape, where the conflicts are, where the alignments are. And so then transposing those live real-time maps into then presentation so that people can reflect back on a particular experience they've had together working through an issue. So that's a particular application, you could say, of this technology. And one, of course, another major use is using maps as a presentation aid themselves. In other words, being able to get a group of people together to look in the round at how a whole subject is laid out structurally. And just one last thought about memory. The very word remember comes from the Latin prefix re, and then member. The re means obviously again or back. Member means structure, as in a member of a building, a structure. So it's all about structuring back. So when we understand memory as really the structure of information, then we can see how this particular technology is so powerful, because it's structural as well as creative. It's logical as well as intuitive. It's kind of rational as well as being synesthetic, in the sense of all the senses are involved. So this is just a very brief tutorial and background on the application of mind maps and where they've come from, what they're about. And throughout this talk, we're going to be taking a tour of the gallery and also looking. So let's take a look at some mind maps. These first two maps are both based on books from colleagues of mine. This is a book called The Dinosaur Strain by Mark Brown. And what I've done here is to deconstruct the book and his work to basically lay it all out in a way that really reflects the way the brain and the mind actually process information. This next map, Awakening at Earth, from Peter Russell, again was with me in the 70s and 80s. This is very classic map actually, and also a classic book. It was one of the first books that really popularized the whole new approach to sustainable thinking to create a sustainable planet. I made this, I think, in 1986, 25 years ago. Moving on, this is a mind map I create for a course I run in business modeling. And as you can see here, there are multiple centers, and these multiple centers reflect the core disciplines of a whole new approach to modeling a business. And I use this particularly at the business school called the Bainbridge Graduate Institute, which is in Seattle, Washington State. Moving on, follow me around to this particular map. This next map is a map on naturopathy and Chinese medicine. This is a map I used in a course I run twice a year for the National College of Natural Medicine based in Portland, Oregon, in the USA. And again, it looks at here the naturopathy and all the disciplines and the different philosophies and approaches to naturopathy. And this side is more to do with Chinese medicine and looking at particularly classical Chinese medicine. Let's see. I'm particularly fond of this mind map. This was done in the very early 80s, about 82, 83, from the work of a man I studied with for a while, a man called Robert Fritz, known as The Path of Least Resistance. Quite seminal work, actually, looking at the structure of thinking and how that structure can be shifted to get much more effective behavior, much more effective action. Very creative work. So this is a map on that. As you can see, I've used multiple colors here to make it much more of a landscape. So you can think of this really as, it's really cognitive cartography. It's map making for knowledge. And again, it reflects the topography, if you will, of the thinking behind this work. Moving on to this particular map. Is a smaller map, but again, I've set this in a landscape setting. And this is some ideas some friends of mine and I have been thinking out over the last 15 years or so, looking at a whole new approach to democracy, and particularly using the internet to get a much more effective way of polling and also of voting from the population. So this is known as virtual country. So moving on to this larger mind map. So let's spend a little more time on this particular mind map, Managing Planet Earth. I created it in February 1990 as part of a 3-month consulting project with Imperial Chemical Industries in the United Kingdom. And the reason for this was really the backdrop for a 4-day, 5-day retreat. That year, Scientific American had brought out this particular special edition by the same name. And this edition is really 13 scientific articles looking at the whole field of human impact on the planet and the environment. And so I mind mapped these 13 studies and used this really as a backdrop for the work I did with the company. And what is fascinating, and in some ways sad, I would say, is that we knew back then some of the changes that we're experiencing now in 2013. In fact, if we go back to 1972 with the Club of Rome report, it was pretty clear that human impacts were having a pretty disastrous effect on our planetary home. So I've divided this map into 3 or 4 key areas. One is looking at human beings as a global species and what we're now doing in the environment. We're using up to 40% of photosynthetic material, etc. Energy that we're consuming, and really population growth, which is even today, I would say, a very critical issue for us. And then, of course, looking at the kind of planet that we've got, and these are the impacts in terms of biodiversity, climate, water, and so on. and then moving on really to what became known as strategies for sustainable development. What kind of planet can we get if we adopt more sustainable practices in the field of agriculture, energy, manufacturing, and economics, and so on. And then, of course, very important question, what kind of planet do we want? And this is very much an issue of human values and behavior, and really our vision for the future. And what does that vision really mean? And finishing up here, if 80% of the human family are poor, we cannot hope to live in a world at peace. And I think on that note, this is a real wake-up call for us as a human species. And I should add, by the way, that this work, including this map, did have a significant impact on this particular corporation. And I'm happy to say that they made a substantial shift in their business practice and products. So there are many applications of mind mapping, and this particular one was the result of fielding some questions from the faculty of a business school here in California to see how they wanted to shift their curriculum and shift their training. And so these are the main ingredients here, looking at some of the symptoms of the existing performance of the students and looking at some of the steps to improve the training at the business school. So this is a particular application of mind mapping. This one, as you can see, uses a lot of collage. And this was for a course I designed and co-ran called Creativity and Right Livelihood. And this was a residential course for some master's students at a business school in Washington State. And again, it covers a lot of important work to do with meaning of language, looking at creativity in the brain, and also looking at different strategies for building what we call right livelihood, which is really shifting the career towards a more sustainable approach to business. So, yeah. So this map is was actually created in the process of writing a book from Peter Russell. It came out as The White Hole in Time, and I used a lot of graphics which were included in the book. But this is another application of mind mapping to prepare one's thoughts, to think outside the box in preparation for writing, in this case, a book. But this is all about time and what has brought human beings to now. So let's take a look at some of the craft of mind mapping. As you can see, I use a range of tools here. I love the use of brush pens, fiber tip pens, and pastels. I use paints, of course. And when I use pastel work, I usually use a fixative. This particular map we're going to look at is a composite using collage. And so I will often cut items out of magazines. And this particular mind map, if we take a look at it, is on the brain. And it's one that I'm making. As you can see here, we're looking at brain science, or neuroscience really, from the perspective of memory and learning, consciousness and healing, and also the real inspiration behind mind mapping, which is the neurons and how the neurons interconnect. And as you can see here, if you can pick this up, you can see how they literally are growing and networking themselves in the brain. So this particular map will be fully fleshed out over the next couple of weeks, and looking at the research behind neuroscience, and also looking at the different functions and components of the brain as well. So as you can see here, we're using keywords and qualifying words and different kind of displays that really, in a sense, reflect the content of the information. and of course the use of color and creativity. One thing it's important to mention is that when we display information creatively, we directly impact and improve the memory of that information. And this is why personal creativity in the form of this kind of craft is extremely important. And I always put this as primary to the maps we can now make, of course, on computers, which obviously have a great value. But I think the handcraft directly from the hand, mind, and brain is really the primary form.